Hey there. So imagine you're a country that needs oil. Maybe you're Japan, Germany, or India. You need millions of barrels to keep your cars running, your factories operating, and your economy growing. But here's the catch. No matter which country you buy oil from, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Venezuela, you can't pay in your own currency. You have to pay in US dollars. Wait, hold on. Why US dollars? Why not euros, yen, or any other currency? And how did the US convince the entire world to use its currency for oil? More importantly, what does this mean for America's power in the world? In this video, we're going to explore what the petrodollar is, how it was created, why it makes the US so powerful, and whether it's starting to fall apart. Let's get started. Before we talk about the petrodollar, let's first understand what it actually means. The petrodollar is not a special type of currency, it's just regular US dollars that are used to buy and sell oil on the international market. The term petrodollar comes from petroleum, which means oil, and dollar, which is the US currency. So, petrodollar simply means oil traded in US dollars. Now, you might ask, why does this matter? Well, because oil is one of the most important resources in the world. Almost every country needs it. And if every country needs US dollars to buy oil, then the US dollar becomes the most important currency in the world. This gives the United States massive economic and political power. But how did this happen? How did the US manage to make the whole world use its currency for oil? To understand that, we need to go back in time. Now that we know what the petrodollar is, let's move to the next section. Section 1. How did the petrodollar system start? The story of the petrodollar begins in the 1970s during a time of economic crisis in the United States. Before 1971, the US dollar was backed by gold. This system was called the Bretton Woods system. Under this system, other countries could exchange their US dollars for gold at a fixed rate. This made the dollar stable and trusted worldwide. But there was a problem. The US was spending a lot of money on the Vietnam War and domestic programs. They were printing more dollars than they had gold to back them up. Other countries started to notice and demanded their gold back. The US didn't have enough gold to pay everyone. So, in 1971, President Richard Nixon made a shocking decision. He ended the gold standard. This meant the US dollar was no longer backed by gold. It became fiat money, which means it only has value because the government says so and people believe in it. This created a big problem. If the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore, why would other countries keep using it? The value of the dollar started to fall and confidence in the US economy weakened. The US needed a new way to make the world want dollars. And that's where oil came in. In 1973, the US made a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter at the time. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in US dollars. In exchange, the US would provide military protection and support to Saudi Arabia. This agreement was made by US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Saudi leaders. Soon after, other oil-producing countries in OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, followed Saudi Arabia's lead. They all agreed to price and sell oil in US dollars. And just like that, the petrodollar system was born. Now, every country that wanted to buy oil had to first get US dollars. This created massive demand for the dollar and made it the dominant global currency once again. Section 2. Why is the petrodollar so powerful? Now that we know how the petrodollar started, let's talk about why it's so powerful and what benefits it gives to the United States. The first benefit is constant demand for US dollars. Since oil is traded in dollars, every country needs to hold large reserves of US dollars. Even if a country like China wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, it has to exchange its yuan for US dollars first. This creates endless demand for the dollar, keeping its value strong. The second benefit is cheaper borrowing for the US government. Because so many countries hold US dollars and buy US Treasury bonds, the US government can borrow money at very low interest rates. This allows the US to run large deficits and fund its military, infrastructure, and programs without facing the same consequences other countries would. If any other country tried to borrow as much as the US, investors would demand higher interest rates or refuse to lend altogether. But because the dollar is so essential, the US gets special treatment. The third benefit is economic and political leverage. The US can use the dollar as a weapon. If a country does something the US doesn't like, America can impose sanctions and cut that country off from the dollar-based financial system. For example, when the US sanctioned Iran, it became very hard for Iran to sell oil because most buyers couldn't pay in dollars. This crippled Iran's economy. The same happened to Russia after it invaded Ukraine. The US and its allies froze Russian dollar reserves and blocked Russian banks from the global payment system. This shows how powerful control over the world's reserve currency can be. The fourth benefit is funding the trade deficit. The US imports far more than it exports, which means it buys more goods from other countries than it sells. Normally, this would weaken a country's currency, but because other countries need dollars to buy oil, they're willing to accept dollars in exchange for their goods. This allows the US to keep importing without its currency collapsing. So the petrodollar doesn't just make the US dollar powerful, it makes the United States itself more powerful economically, politically, and militarily. Section 3. What are the downsides of the petrodollar? Now, the petrodollar might sound like a perfect system for the US, but it's not all positive. There are downsides and criticisms too. The first downside is that it creates dependency. The US economy has become dependent on the petrodollar system. If countries stop using the dollar for oil, demand for the dollar would drop, and the US would face serious economic problems. It would become more expensive for the US to borrow money, and the value of the dollar could fall. The second downside is global resentment. Many countries don't like being forced to use US dollars. They see it as the US having too much control over the global economy. Some argue that it's unfair for one country to have this much power just because of a deal made decades ago. This resentment has led some countries to look for alternatives, which we'll talk about soon. The third downside is that it ties U.S. foreign policy to oil-producing countries. To keep the petrodollar system alive, the U.S. has to maintain good relationships with major oil exporters, especially in the Middle East. This sometimes forces the U.S. to support regimes it might not otherwise support, just to keep the oil flowing in dollars. The fourth downside is it can harm other economies. Because the dollar is so dominant, when the U.S. changes its interest rates or prints more money, it affects the whole world. For example, when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it can cause capital to flow out of developing countries, hurting their economies. So, while the petrodollar benefits the US, it also creates challenges and tensions globally. Section 4 is the petrodollar system breaking down. So here's the big question. Is the petrodollar system falling apart? Well, there are definitely signs that it's being challenged. Let's look at some examples. First, China has been pushing to trade oil in yuan. China is the world's largest oil importer, and it wants to reduce its dependence on the US dollar. In 2018, China launched the Shanghai Crude Oil Futures, which allows oil to be traded in yuan. China has also made deals with countries like Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia to buy oil in yuan instead of dollars. Second, Russia has been moving away from the dollar. After being hit with US sanctions, Russia started reducing its dollar reserves and trading oil in other currencies like euros and yuan. Russia and China have even discussed creating a new payment system that doesn't rely on the dollar. Third, Saudi Arabia, the key player in the petrodollar system, has hinted at accepting other currencies. In recent years, Saudi Arabia has grown closer to China and has discussed the possibility of selling oil in yuan. If Saudi Arabia officially moves away from the dollar, it could seriously weaken the petrodollar system. Fourth, the rise of digital currencies and alternative payment systems. Some countries are exploring central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, as a way to bypass the dollar. If these systems become widely adopted, the need for US dollars in international trade could decrease. So, is the petrodollar dying? Not yet. The US dollar is still the dominant global currency, and most oil is still traded in dollars, but the system is definitely being challenged, and the US can't take its dominance for granted anymore. Section 5. What happens if the petrodollar collapses? Now, let's imagine a future where the petrodollar system actually collapses. What would happen? Well, the consequences would be huge, especially for the United States. First, the value of the US dollar would drop. If countries no longer need dollars to buy oil, demand for the dollar would fall. This would make the dollar weaker, causing inflation in the US as imported goods become more expensive. Second, borrowing costs would rise. The US government relies on low interest rates to borrow trillions of dollars. If demand for US Treasury bonds falls, interest rates would go up. This would make it much more expensive for the US to fund its military, social programs, and infrastructure. Third, the US would lose its economic leverage. Without the petrodollar, the US would have less power to impose sanctions and control global finance. Countries like Russia, Iran, and China would have more freedom to operate outside US influence. Fourth, it could lead to a multipolar currency world. Instead of one dominant currency, we might see several regional currencies used for trade. The euro, yuan, and even digital currencies could rise in importance. This would make global trade more complex but also more balanced. However, a petrodollar collapse wouldn't happen overnight. It would be a gradual process, and the US would likely take steps to defend the dollar's dominance. But the world is clearly moving toward a future where the dollar is less dominant than it once was. So, in conclusion, the petrodollar is one of the main reasons the US dollar is the world's most powerful currency. It was created through a clever deal in the 1970s and has given the US massive economic and political advantages for decades. But now, that system is being challenged by countries like China, Russia, and even traditional US allies. Whether the petrodollar survives or collapses will shape the future of the global economy. And maybe your next question is, what is a currency war? Or how does China plan to replace the US dollar? Maybe that's for another video. If you want me to make other videos explaining these topics, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.